Being an entrepreneur, you have to be incredibly resilient, both mentally and physically, because you're putting through a roller coaster ride of emotions, of stress, of problems day to day, minute to minute.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Liberty Ventures podcast. I'm Alexander McCoben, founder and CEO of Liberty Ventures. And the reason we do these podcasts is to keep growing the movement of values-aligned business leaders, investors, executives, and entrepreneurs who are committed to making the world a freer and more prosperous place and to share insights from the community. And last week, Nancy Fechnay and I got to spend a lot of time together at the first Principal Business Summit at Necker Island, which was absolutely amazing. And I was just blown away by Nancy's perspective of the world, the way she approaches business and investing. And it's not just from her background, having started and run 3 tech companies and starting Unique Ventures, which advises and supports positive impact venture funds and startups, but just the energy that she brings. And so, Nancy, thank you so much for joining this podcast and sharing your wisdom with the community today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad we're doing this. I in true spirit, wore my Necker Island t-shirt, since we aren't there anymore, we can be there in spirit.
Always in spirit. That's right. Now, Nancy, I gave a very brief overview of your background, but I'd love to start by just asking you to share your story with everyone. What's led to who you are and what you're doing these days?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. So I think I've always been an entrepreneur at heart. I started my first, I tried to start my first business as a kid, selling bracelets and lemonade, that kind of childhood outside my parents' home. And then I convinced at 14, a local business owner to let me sell sweatshirts near the bar because that's where all the lifeguards went. And so I would stand by the bar and try and sell t-shirts, but whatever I sold, I got to keep 50% because he didn't have a t-shirt or sweatshirt girl. And I think it's funny that I look back and I won't say how many years now ago that was, but it was a long time ago, and they still have that t-shirt girl now at that restaurant, which is a staple in Bethany Beach, Delaware. And so it's just always trying to find new ways to solve problems, make a little bit of money. It was just kind of part of my personality. And I fast forward and I've actually now started 4 businesses, 1 nonprofit. The 3 tech companies are one of those 4 or some of those 4, and then a pro sports team. So it's been all over the place. And in between everyone, I jokingly took a vacation as a VC. Now, I will say having your own VC fund is not a vacation. But when you work for someone else's institutional VC fund, it's a bit easier than being an entrepreneur, at least in my experience.
So it sounds like you did have that entrepreneurial spirit from your early days. I'm curious, of all the companies that you started, which one did you have the most fun building up, or that sticks out in your mind?
The one that I'm the most proud of and that really kind of was most in alignment with who I am is actually the nonprofit. It's focused on mental health. I started with focusing on mental health for entrepreneurs in particular.
And this is the Inspire movement, right?
Yeah. This is long before mental health was like a thing we talked about, and this was also when I was living in the UK, where it's not within their culture really to talk about emotions or to show vulnerability. Things stay very surface level for the most part, unless you're in your core group of friends. And so for me, it was really important because there were a lot of suicide attempts. There were a lot of very sick entrepreneurs that were, associating themselves and their life with their companies. And so when their companies failed, they felt like a failure. And they didn't really have an outlet that was known for them and support system for them to talk about these struggles of these highs and lows and the roller coaster ride of being an entrepreneur. And so I started it kind of without really too much thought, and then it just took off. And so for me, that really was the most impactful business I've ever built, that gave me the most joy to see people and how it changed their lives and how much an impact it had on generally on the mental health movement, but also on entrepreneurs themselves.
There are 2 things that really stand out to me about this that I love. The first is that you're calling a nonprofit a business. I think too many people split those 2 things apart in their minds. They think nonprofits somehow are different, but at the end of the day, it's just a different tax structure. Otherwise, you're still building a business, an organization with all the complexities and challenges of a for-profit, just a different revenue model, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't think of it that way, that's when you usually have inefficient systems or unsustainable business models, which then end up failing. And so I think the nonprofit, I mean, we could diverge onto a path all about this. I have very strong thoughts about nonprofits in general, but I think if you aren't looking at it like a business, like a startup, you're doing it all wrong.
Well, let's actually go down that before I get to my second point. So how do you advise nonprofits to think like a business and to think like a startup?
You should think almost exactly the same. It's exactly what you said, right? It's just a different tax structure. You want to be efficiently running a business. You want to be hiring the talent. You want to be making sure that, if you're running the business efficiently, essentially all of your profit is just going to another cause versus it going back into the company. But sometimes it does go back into the company in order for it to grow larger. And so from my perspective, the reason that the nonprofit world has so many issues is because it doesn't attract the best talent because they're not paying as well as in the private sector. It's not as shiny. So, like the shiny object syndrome doesn't always happen with nonprofits. And the culture is quite different in that sense. So, it's not as, sought after from the young talent. And then the last is that a lot of them aren't thinking first about sustainable business model. They're thinking first about how do we give money to those in need. But the reality is, if you're not building a sustainable business model with real growth potential, you're not going to be able to have as much of an impact as you would otherwise.
All I can say is preach. That this is such an important lesson for the nonprofit space. And, my background is largely in nonprofits and still work with some of them. And I think that it's absolutely on point.
Well, what do you think then? I'll throw it back to you.
Well, it's exactly that. And I think a lot of people go into the nonprofit world thinking it's very different from business. They're not going to have to worry about revenue models. They're not going to have to worry about scalability, organizational structure. They think the intentions of everyone involved will be enough to get them through whatever challenges they have. And that's a good starting point, but it is just a business at the end of the day. And we need the best minds to be thinking about how to run nonprofits as effectively as they think about how to run for-profits. Now, the second thing I love about the Inspire movement is the focus on mental health for entrepreneurs. And especially in the Liberty Ventures ecosystem, we have a lot of entrepreneurs. And I think you were spot on when you said for most entrepreneurs, and I'll throw myself in with this, yeah, we do tie our identities to the businesses, to what we're starting, including nonprofit entrepreneurs. And if something's going wrong with the business, something's going wrong in our own life, and people can get really depressed. They can feel very alone. So how did the Inspire movement does work with entrepreneurs to help them with their mental health? What's some advice you have for any entrepreneurs listening to this right now?
Oh, those are two separate questions. Yeah, we might have to give me the second one again. But how we worked was the way we started was to put someone on stage that other entrepreneurs would look up to and asked them to tell their story with their struggle of mental health for the first time publicly. And then talk about how they got through it, because that meant the people in the audience could relate and understand that they weren't alone, and that someone that they looked up to and they thought must be perfect and never had these issues actually had these issues too, and was able to move through the lows in order to get to more highs. But that is just a cycle, and that I'll flow into the second part of the question. It's just a cycle. Being an entrepreneur, you have to be incredibly resilient. One of the most important qualities is resilience, and both mentally and physically, because you're putting yourself through a roller coaster ride of emotions, of stress, of problems day to day, minute to minute. And so that's number one, just be resilient. Number two, the way to be resilient in a way that's healthy is to set strong boundaries. And that means work-life balance or integration, as our friend James says. You have to make sure that you are also prioritizing yourself and your family and your friends at some point in time throughout the day. Because if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of your company, no matter how urgent everything feels, because it will always feel like there's 1,000 things to do. It never stops when you're the CEO or founder of a company. It never stops. So making sure that you have a strong morning routine, a midday break for some sort of stress release, whether that's, for me, it's meditation, pickleball, ice bath, sauna, walking outside, something like that. For others, and it might be dance, it might be breath work. Everybody has their own. And then at the end of the day, making sure you have time where you are shut off your phone and your devices and are taking time with your family, with your friends, with your community, with your tribe, whatever's going to nurture your soul. Because if you're not doing that and you're constantly pushing and just working 7 days a week, you burn out and your brain speed goes down and your ability to handle stress goes down. and then your company eventually suffers. So I think that the work ethic in America that we push on entrepreneurs is actually all backwards, and that it makes them much more inefficient and not as resilient as it would if we accepted the fact that we're all human.
Here, here. And to bring in advice from another one of our friends, John Mackey, the way he explained this to me, actually, that was incredibly helpful for me as an entrepreneur, was he looks at all the different things that he does, the different identities people associate with him, and he sees them as different outfits that he wears. Sure, he was the founder of Whole Foods. That was just one outfit in his life. He's also a husband. He's also a nature lover. He's also a hiker. And having that separation of who he is from the different roles he has, different responsibilities he has, allows him to balance everything. And I think take a much healthier approach to being an entrepreneur and being able to take on all those responsibilities. Because as soon as I started to realize I'm not just my job, I'm not just whatever organization I'm building right now, I actually was more effective at it because I could take a more objective view. I was more balanced, and I was able to bring my best self to the table.
Yeah. I mean, well, I think we all also in business, and this is like a bit of a sidetrack comment, but it made me think of this. I think the best business people also have the ability to be chameleons. So you can show up as your true authentic self, but your true authentic self has different variations. And so you're then able to be put in difficult situations, or situations that would be difficult to others that are unknown to you, that are not your comfort zone, and still perform and still connect and still create business opportunities, sell yourself, sell your business, whatever that may be, because you can connect with that person because you're seeing them and you're kind of showing them a portion or a mirror version of themselves in you. And that's what I mean by chameleon.
100%. And I think a lot of really successful business leaders understand that. And some people might think that that's something that you're born with rather than something that you learn. I'm curious where you fall on that. Do you think people can learn to be both authentic as to who they are, but chameleons in interacting with other people? And if so, how have you done that for yourself?
Wow, that's a great question. I've never really thought about that actually. I think I did learn it. I've always been very outgoing and happy person, and like love people and love interacting with people. That's something it's always been a part of who I am. But I look back on others, like my brother, for example, and he is incredible with people, but he's actually an introvert. And I've learned a lot of techniques as well. How did I learn that? I think through marrying. I think through watching my father, who was also an entrepreneur, and how he handled all the different types of people, watching my mentors and how they, kind of shifted in different scenarios to be different people. And I'm sure you can learn it through studying and books as well. There are definitely ways to learn it is my conclusion, but I really hadn't spent much time thinking about it. It was, I think, a necessary skill set to adopt. And so I just adopted it.
All right. Now, before we move off of the entrepreneurship side, I mean, since you've started and built so many businesses, is there anything else that you would share with any entrepreneurs listening as to what you think is critical to being successful as an entrepreneur, or anything that was critical for you?
Yeah, I think persistence and almost a unhealthy amount of optimism. So believing in your idea and your abilities more than anyone else, to a point of even when loved ones tell you you can't do it, you're like, you're crazy. I can't do this. Because you're going to get beaten down so many times and told that it's impossible, or that you're crazy, or that you're doing it wrong. And you just have to have such a belief in yourself that you're almost manifesting it through your own belief that you can make it happen. But the number one quality, I'd say actually the three qualities that I've seen in the most successful entrepreneurs is this chameleon ability, because you have to be able to sell your business always, persistence, and an optimism, but to an extent that it's almost like you're a crazy optimist to believe that you can change the world.
Invaluable advice. Thank you, Nancy. Now let's pivot over to your time now as an angel investor or just or a venture capitalist. What was that transition like for you?
I didn't really, I basically have done the pattern of start a company, be a VC, start a company, be a VC. And I did that back and forth 5 times until recently, when I've taken on this role of like advisor, coach, investor, operator, kind of getting more involved. It's somewhere between being a full-time VC investor and a full-time entrepreneur, where I do work with some on like strategy and operations, help with maybe they need a new hire or whatever. And sometimes it's just coaching the entrepreneur, advising them and helping them move forward with their business. And sometimes I've done a few turnarounds already in the last year where it's been come in, realize there's a big mess, fix it for a few months, get the, train back on the track and then push it forward and watch it go. So I think it really depends on how you frame it, but it's certainly different if you're curious about just the full-time investor versus the full-time entrepreneur. From my experience, being a full-time investor was much easier. And that's because it's easy. It was easier for me because it's not that I was working less. Sometimes I was, not at Kleiner. At Kleiner, I was working, I worked more at Kleiner than I even worked on some of my own companies. I mean, to the point where I remember nights where I couldn't see my computer screen anymore because I'd been using my eyes too much for like 14 hours straight or whatever, staring at a computer screen. But the stress level was different because when you're a VC, you don't have, unless you run your own firm like you do, you don't have people whose livelihood is dependent on your ability to run the company. You have a salary that you know is coming, and it's usually a fat salary. You can turn off your computer and walk away if you so choose to, and it's not going to hurt anyone else. But I think as an entrepreneur, and I was almost always, for all of my companies, 4 out of 5, I was CEO. It's much different because I would be up. I couldn't sleep at night most nights because I was thinking, if we were going through a tough period, how am I going to make payroll? How am I going to solve that problem? One of my more recent companies, I poached 2 people from Google and they were getting paid ridiculous amounts, of salary. And I convinced them to come and work for me for free, basically for equity. And I think as a human being, because of who I am, I feel a big sense of responsibility as a CEO. And so for me, it's much better for my mental health to be a VC or an advisor or very active advisor, but an advisor nonetheless than the actual person building the company.
That intuitively makes sense to me for the reasons you said. But even as an investor and working at a venture capital firm, you're still responsible for delivering results. And I feel like for me, there's definitely a certain level of stress in making sure that you are delivering or that I'm delivering for them. But that's really interesting.
I think to me, it was a different kind of stress. Don't get me wrong. I was definitely stressed. I mean, there was one weekend I took 1 weekend off when I was at Kleiner, 1 weekend, and the entire time I was there, and I cried. I remember having a panic attack because my phone dropped service while we were on an island. And I had a panic attack because I thought one of the partners wouldn't be able to get a hold of me. So don't get me wrong. I was definitely stressed. It was just a different type of stress.
With all of your experience in investing at this point, what's your general philosophy for how you look at startups to evaluate as part of your diligence? Do you have a framework that you use? Are there certain things that you think are most important? Love to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think that I have a secret sauce, but I don't think it's the answer to your question. So I think an answer to your question, I don't think I look at anything different than you probably look at and every other investor looks at, like, how does this company, is this defensible? Is there competition? What's the competition look like? Who are their customers? What are their KPIs? What does the team look like? Do I think that they're unique? Do I think that they're the right ones to solve this problem? Like, what's the advisory team look like? What's the board look like? What's their cap table, their finances? Like, all the things that you look at and that every other investor looks at, I looked at. I think the way that only, my secret sauce or my unique approach, and this is going to sound very spiritual and maybe a bit woo-woo, is that every time I made a decision that my intuition agreed with, I did well. And every time I went against it and made the investment anyways, because it just looked so good from an analytical standpoint, those companies have not done well. And so what I realized in evaluating my portfolio is that it has to be an intuitive yes and an analytical yes. It can't be just an analytical yes.
I think there's a lot of wisdom to that because there are more and more studies coming out showing that our gut actually has a certain level of intelligence, that our body knows when something feels right, looks right, even if it's lower than our analytical reasoning is able to figure out, because our body sees other patterns that may not be at the forefront of our consciousness in making decisions.
I think there's a lot to be said there, but I think that it's not a massively accepted logic yet. It's more a theory by a few versus everybody, accepting it. Although, we did meet at your summit, which was a selection of conscious individuals that probably all believe in our intuitive abilities, because it is the subconscious knowing the future and trying to protect us from the future or from a negative thing that could happen in the future.
Now, in getting to that intuitive reasoning, how much of that do you think is just your experience at this point? You've been through so many OODA loops of investing in business that you've got that kind of reasoning, that sound.
I do think I've always said there's a bit of pattern recognition in venture for sure. And being an investor, even like hearing a founder say a sentence and being like, they said this, but they actually meant this, and knowing the difference, it comes from pattern, right? It comes from like years and years of experience. So it's hard for me to place a percentage on intuition versus reading between the lines and knowing like if you ask a founder about revenue, but then they quote you like MRR versus ARR, like what the difference is, why they might be doing that, like, catching that in the first place, those types of things. I think you have to be a pretty experienced investor to know when to what to catch and what matters, what's a red flag, what's a yellow flag, what doesn't matter at all. But I don't think I've put that in the analytical pile because that's data related versus intuitive.
Okay, so some people in the Liberty Ventures community are new angel investors. They just became accredited or they just had an exit and they're getting started with this. What advice might you have for any of them who are just getting started with angel investing?
So I hope this doesn't go against your philosophy for them. But the advice I always give new angel investors is if you're going to become an angel investor, make sure you're making at least 10 to 20 investments a year. I would like it to be closer to 20 than 10, just because you're going to the slots and you're betting. And it's fun and exciting and you want to do it, but please don't make 3 investments a year because the likelihood of one of those investments being a great return is very low. You're increasing your odds the more investments you make. So if that means that you have 100K and you put it in 20 versus 100K in 10, I'd rather you put it in 20 than 10. Get a feel for it, get an understanding for it. It helps you build out your pattern recognition. And with time, you can increase your check size. The other thing is I personally don't, recommend, I personally recommend if you're going to be an angel investor to invest in what you know or invest in something that excites you and that you will then learn about. Because what you don't want is to be, you've never looked at, I don't know, like anything in space tech, and then you go make a bunch of space tech company investment because they sound really cool. But the reality is a space tech expert would look at it and be like, oh, these are all shit. If it's something outside of your knowledge zone, it's probably not the place to start.
I encourage anyone who's listening who's able to help with that to reach out to Nancy. But I'll also say, Nancy, that's very similar to what we're doing with the Liberty Ventures community as well. So we're going to need some additional time to talk that through to see how many more companies we're able to help out together. Nancy, thank you so much, really.